Turn your Bibles to 1 Corinthians 11. We'll try to get this finished up today on the head covering and move on to the Lord's Supper. But I spent 3 weeks on it. I think it was worth the time because it's not something we talk about that much. And so it's good to kind of dig in a little bit and see if we can learn a little bit more than perhaps we had learned in the past. So I think it was worth the time to do it. But we got down to verse 10 last week, so we'll just start where we left off. And just to kind of summarize real quickly, according to the view that I've been espousing here, if you're not praying or prophesying, these verses don't apply to you. And we don't have anybody doing that today. And so these verses have no application for us today because there's nobody engaged in those activities. We come down here to verse 11, though, and he's giving a little bit of a caution here against, for lack of a better word, manly arrogance. Sometimes when men hear that phrase, women submit, it gives them the big head. And so he is cautioning here against manly arrogance against women. And he reminds in verse 11, nevertheless, in spite of all the things I've said, verse 3 in particular, that man is head of woman, nevertheless, neither is man independent of the woman, nor woman independent of the man and the Lord. Man and woman need each other. It's not big me and little you, big man and little woman. Man and woman need each other. They're not independent of one another. And he explains why in the next verse. For as the woman came through the man, even so woman came from man. I'll get it right in a second. Woman came from man, even so man also comes through the woman. But all things are from God. So woman came from man in the sense that Eve was created from Adam's rib. So that's the sense in which woman comes from man. And yet man comes through woman, because every man that's been born since the beginning has been born of a woman. And so men and women need each other. It is not an adversarial relationship. And so a very strong caution here against arrogance on the part of men against women. And then in verse 13, an illustration of the head covering. He's going to use basically their customs to illustrate the difference between the sexes. He says, judge among yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. Now this whole section here hinges on this little word nature. And a lot of people assume that means you're born with this knowledge. Well, think about that a second. I brought that up last week. I was raised in the 60s and 70s. Long hair was the norm for men. That was the norm. I didn't feel any shame. I had long hair, never felt any shame. I still don't feel any shame about having long hair back in the 70s. That's not something you're born with. You're not born with it. So nature has a different meaning here. And what I did was, for this chart, I just put up the definition from Mr. Thayer, Joseph Henry Thayer, who's a Greek scholar, and he gives us at least 4 definitions of the word nature, depending on the context. And so once again, word meanings have different applications depending on the context. Never forget that. That's a powerful lesson for us. It will go into our Bible interpretation class on Wednesday nights as well. But the first definition is the nature of things, the force laws, the order of nature, as opposed to what's monstrous or abnormal or perverse. Now, for that definition, Mr. Thayer cites Romans 1:26. Now, the stuff I put up there in white is me. The stuff up there in yellow is Mr. Thayer. And I did that so we could distinguish between what I said and what he says. I don't want anybody to think that Thayer said all this stuff, because the stuff that's in white, I'm saying. But Mr. Thayer cites Romans 1:26 for that first definition. And Romans 1:26, I believe, if memory serves, is talking about homosexuality, lesbianism specifically. But in Romans 1:26, he says, if I ever get my Bible over there, he says, the women exchange the natural use for what is against nature. And so it's natural for men and women to be together. It is not natural for women and women to be together. That's against nature. That's monstrous, that's perverse, that's abnormal. And that's the way nature works, male and female, if you want to reproduce. That's how it works. And so that's definition number 1 for nature. I don't believe that's what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians 11. Then you have nature by birth or physical origin. That's definition number 2. And you find the scripture for that in Galatians 2:15, where Paul talks about we who are Jews by nature. Galatians 2:15, and notice how he contrasts that with the Gentiles. He says, we who are Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles. By nature there clearly means by birth. If you're a Jew, you were a Jew by birth. You were born into the family of Abraham. And so nature can mean by birth. It doesn't always mean that, but it can mean that. And then thirdly, the word nature can mean a mode of feeling and acting which by long habit has become nature. And I used the illustration last week. It's my nature to have a cup of coffee every morning. I wasn't born doing that, but I developed that habit over time. That has become a habit for me. And Mr. Thayer cites Ephesians 2 and verse 3, which is a great passage, especially if you're talking to a Baptist or a Calvinist of some kind where they believe that we're born sinners. And one of their favorite passages is Ephesians 2:3. He says, among whom we also once conducted ourselves in the lust of the flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath just as the others. Now, if you ever talk to a Baptist, they key in on that word nature, and they try to give it definition too. That's where the Baptist is coming from on Ephesians 2. We were by nature, by birth, they say, children of wrath. You're born a sinner. Now, if that was the only definition of nature, we'd have a problem, wouldn't we? They might be right. They might be right, but that's not the only definition of nature. And when you look at the context here, look at verse 3 again. Among whom we once conducted. What's conduct? That's the way you live your life. And then you go on down. We once conducted ourselves in the lust of the flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature, by conduct, by habit, you see. And so Mr. Thayer, I think, has got that nailed. And nature can mean habit. I brought with me a translation of the New Testament by Brother Hugo McCord. He was a member of the body of Christ. I think he would be on what we would call the institutional side of the fence. But he made a translation. He was a scholar. He made a translation of the New Testament. And in his translation of Ephesians 2:3, it says this: we all once live in them, in our fleshly desires, indulging the cravings of the flesh and of the mind, and were by custom children of wrath. So you see what he did with that? We were by custom children of wrath. And I believe that's the way nature is being used there in 1 Corinthians as well. Does not nature teach you? You're not born with that knowledge. You're not born with the knowledge that men should have short hair and women should have long hair. But we look around the culture, we look around the society, and generally speaking, not always, there are exceptions, even in this very room, there are exceptions. But generally speaking, women tend to have long hair and men tend to have short hair. And so he's using the word nature in that sense. The mode of feeling and acting of society, which has become nature, to become the way things are. Generally speaking, customarily, if you please, customarily women have longer hair and customarily men have short hair. I don't think he's making any argument here at all about the sinfulness of it, because if you're going to make that argument, you're going to have to define how long is long and how short is short. And you're going to have to draw a line somewhere, and you're going to have to deal with Samson in the Old Testament and the Nazirite vow in the Old Testament, where both men and women grew their hair out, and both men and women at the end of the vow shaved their heads. So clearly, it seems clear to me that nature in 1 Corinthians 11 is not talking about birth or even natural characteristics, because I've seen men who have grown their hair out. They can grow hair just as long as any woman. I told some of you there was a young man who used to lead singing over at Burkesville years ago, and he had long hair, probably longer than Lisa's. And he kind of looked feminine. And it was awkward to see him up there leading singing. I thought it was very awkward. And I always thought, well, that fellow ought to grow a mustache or a beard or something, at least something to show that he looked like a man. Because without that, he looked kind of girlish. He looked kind of feminine. But now I forgot where I was going with that. But these things they change from culture to culture. They change from custom to custom. Finally, the last use of nature, is the sum of innate properties and powers by which one person differs from another. And he cites James 3 and verse 7. And if you look that up in the Greek, like I did when I was preparing this, it's the word kind. And every kind of beast and of bird and of reptile. Notice that. Each one of them has a different nature. The kind of beast, the kind of bird, the kind of reptile, and the kind of creature. And so nature is being used to describe the properties. Whatever it is that makes you a bird, or whatever it is that makes you a beast, or whatever it is that makes you a man, these are the innate properties and powers by which one person or one thing differs from another. And so notice 4 different definitions of the word nature. We have to figure out which one plugs into 1 Corinthians 11. It is my belief, you don't have to share that belief, but it is my belief that it's definition number 3, that he's talking about customarily. When you look around, customarily, women tend to have longer hair and men tend to have shorter hair. And this becomes an illustration. Notice he says, judge in yourselves. Think about this. Look around you. Look at the world around you. And he's trying to argue for a distinction in the sexes between men and women. And that is supposed to be an illustration of the head covering. The longer hair kind of resembles a head covering. And so that's the idea. So let's go back and read that again. Judge among yourselves, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it's a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. The word for there, the Greek word anti, which means instead of. This is her natural covering. And that gets back to where when we first started. There's actually 2 coverings in this text. There's the artificial covering, and there's the natural covering, the one given by God. And so there's the hair, and then there's the artificial covering. And her hair is given instead of a covering. And so he's saying that kind of illustrates the head covering. It shows that there's a difference between men and women, and it should be respected. And that's why when a woman is doing something she normally is not allowed to do, praying or prophesying, women weren't normally allowed to take public roles in the church. And we talked about that, keeping silent, being in submission. And so if God gifted them to do this, they had to wear the head covering to show the distinction here. Before we get to that last verse, any questions or comments? Yes?
I do. I didn't get a chance to ask last Sunday
about
the last part of chapter 10. I'm sorry to get back.
Oh, no, that's fine.
Where it says because of the angels. What does that
Oh, yeah, and I forgot to mention that. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, verse 10, because I didn't even talk about that last week. I'm glad you brought that up. And I wish I knew the answer. But I'll take a stab at it, okay? For this, verse 10, for this reason a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. And that's always been a mystery phrase. Because, what in the world does that mean? There's been all sorts of viewpoints taken. Some people say, some of the old scholars would say, well, angels were present in the assemblies, and the women had to cover their heads so the angels wouldn't lust. I find that to be a little far-fetched. I find that explanation to be a little far-fetched. To me, the best explanation is to kind of look at what the angels did in the past. Over in, for example, Jude 6. Jude verse 6, the angels who did not keep their proper domain but left their own habitation, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness. What did the angels do? They fell. They sinned. And he's saying here to the women, don't be like the angels. Don't be rebellious. They were rebellious. They left their own habitation. They rebelled against God, and God cast them down. Don't be like them. Put the head covering on because God wants you to, and wear that so you're not like. Now, to me, that's the most likely explanation, but in all honesty, I don't really know for sure what it means. It's a mystery phrase. It just seems like it just pops in there out of nowhere, and it's like, what does it mean? And I just think it's in the context of everything about authority and headship, that he's simply saying, don't be like the angels in rebellion. They rebelled and they got punished for it. You don't need to be a rebellious woman. Put your head covering on when you're praying or prophesying. That's my take.
The angels, we don't understand how great a power the angels had.
Yeah.
But we know they were very powerful and all. But they were subject to God. They had no authority of their own.
Yeah.
They were under they are under authority.
Yes.
And I don't know if that's making the connection, but I mean.
Okay, yeah, it could be because they were
and
under the authority of God, and the women should. That's a good point.
they had to show
Yeah, that's a great point. I hadn't even thought of
submission
that.
and that
Yeah.
they were under authority.
That makes sense too. It really does. Now, verse 16, if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. Now, usually the advocates of the covering view hang their hat on this verse, that he called the wearing of a veil a custom. And again, if that's your viewpoint, that's fine. I'm not going to argue with you about it because I don't think we can nail this down with 100% certainty. But think about the language here for just, if anyone seems to be a contentious, what's a contentious man?
Somebody wants to argue all the time.
Yeah, wants to argue. Some people are just contentious. They like to argue. And in this context of women covering their heads when they pray or prophesy and men not covering their heads, what would a contentious man say?
Depends on which side he's on.
Well, if he's contentious against the truth, he wants to argue, what would a contentious man
They
say?
tell you they all got to wear a cover.
Yeah, he'd say just the opposite, wouldn't he? He'd say, well, I think women ought to uncover their heads. And men ought to cover. That's what a contentious man would say. And so what he's saying is, that's not our practice. This is our practice. What I've outlined here is our practice. And if a man is contentious, he wants to argue, that's not what we do. We don't have women with uncovered heads when they pray and prophesy. That's not allowed. They have to cover their heads. And so a lot of translations will, and it is a softening, but I think it is also a clarification. They'll say, we have no other custom. Literally, it's no such custom. But a lot of translations will say we have no other custom. We don't have any other practice than the one that I have laid out here in the text. And so that's my take on verse 16. But I'm well aware of the fact, and we covered that in earlier classes, that the advocates of the custom view will latch onto that verse as their proof. And if that satisfies you, that's fine with me. That's all I got to say about 1 Corinthians 11. Any questions or comments? Okay, we'll move into the next section then on the Lord's Supper. Starting at chapter 11, and not starting here, but starting way back at verse 1, he's addressing problems relative to their public worship. They had a lot of problems. One of them was the prophesying women and men and how they appeared. But now he moves on to another one, now in giving these instructions. And here he's moving on to problems relative to the Lord's Supper. There was at least 3 ways in which they perverted the Lord's Supper. Okay. By the way, before I go any further, notice the contrast between verse 2 and verse 17. In verse 2, I praise you. Okay. And then he starts talking about the head covering. And I told you earlier, the problem wasn't wearing the covering. The problem was he was explaining why they should wear it. They had no problem wearing it. He said, I praise you that you remember me and you keep the customs as I delivered them to you. I'm glad. But in verse 17 now, he takes a different track. In this matter, I don't praise you because you're not doing what you're told. You're not following what the Lord has commanded you. So in giving you these instructions, I do not praise you since you come together not for the better but for the worse. So this is not good, starting here in verse 17. And the first problem was they had division in the church. And the division was over social class, rich versus poor. Now you can see in verse 18, when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you. So problem number 1 was division. And the division was on the basis of rich versus poor. You can see that in verse 22 when he talks about the little phrase, you shame those who have nothing, in verse 22. Those who have nothing. Who is that? That's the poor, isn't it? Those who have nothing is the poor. And you're shaming the poor. So they had division. Now in chapter 1 through 4, their division was over preacheritis. Remember that? Here they got division over rich versus poor. You had the rich snobs who didn't want to have anything to do with the poor brethren. That's what it comes down to. They get there early and eat everything up, gobble everything up, and they turned it into a common meal and made a mess of it. And most of that was because they didn't even want to have anything to do with their poor brethren. So they had a little bit of an arrogance about it. So you have divisions on the basis of social class. Number 2, the Lord's Supper was perverted into some kind of a common meal. it seems like. And as Brother Randall used to say, it wasn't even a good common meal because they didn't eat it in common. They didn't eat it together. So it wasn't even a good common meal from that perspective. They didn't eat it in common. But you can see that in verse 20 and 21. Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. That's not what you're doing. That's what you're supposed to be doing, but that's not what you're doing. What do you mean? Verse 21. For in eating, he's explaining how they're not eating the Lord's Supper. For in eating, each one takes the Lord's Supper, his own supper. See that? Takes his own supper ahead of others. And one is hungry and another is drunk. So they perverted it into some kind of a common meal, and in the process even turned it into sort of a drunken mess. Can you imagine that? You know, driving up to the parking lot and you're going to go worship God, and you hear people singing, drinking songs and getting loud, and you know, what in the world's going on in there? I mean, that's what's happening here. What a mess. What a mess. So division based on social class, perverting the Lord's Supper into some kind of a common meal, which excluded the poor. And then as a result of that, remember what I said, imagine pulling up to a church building, pulling up in the parking lot, and you hear all that drunken, loud, messy conduct inside. Would that make it hard for you to take the Lord's Supper when you went in there? Yeah. How are you going to focus on the Lord's Supper? And so that brings you down to the latter part where he talks about taking in a worthy manner. Now, taking in a worthy manner means you take it where your mind is focused on the Lord. Well, it's kind of hard to focus my mind on the Lord if the guy sitting next to me is drunk. It's kind of hard for me to focus on the Lord, you see. So, and by the way, it's worthy manner. It's how you take it. It's not whether or not you're worthy. I assure you, you're not. Neither am I. We're not worthy to take the Lord's Supper. We're not worthy of his sacrifice. He's not talking about whether you're worthy. He's talking about you taking it in a worthy way, that you're worshiping in spirit and truth. So you take it in a worthy way. And it'd be hard to do if the guy sitting next to you is drunk and the guy behind you is drunk. It'd be kind of hard to focus on the Lord, wouldn't it? It'd be hard to discern the Lord's body, as he says there. So this was an absolute mess, this thing with the Lord's Supper. Just an absolute disaster, fiasco. And so we start off here, verses 17 through 21. Now, in giving these instructions, I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better, but for the worse. This is not good. What do you mean, Paul? Well, first of all, which implies there's a second, there's something else. I told you there was 3 problems. First of all, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and I in part believe it. Now, notice the phrase, come together as a church. He's talking about a meeting of the congregation. He's not talking about a private gathering in your home where you have some friends over for a social function. He's talking about a gathering of the church, a church assembly, if you please. So when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you. I hear it. This is the scuttlebutt. This is the rumor. And I'm inclined to believe the rumors. I in part believe it. And one of the reasons I believe it is because I know that divisions come. And that's the next verse. There also must be factions among you. Those things happen sometimes. And the reason? Well, think about this for a second. When divisions come, who's the instigator of the division?
The devil.
The old devil, that's right. The old devil's the instigator. But can God use that? Can God use? Sure he can. And sometimes, and that's what he's about ready to say here, God can use things like that to separate the wheat from the chaff. In every congregation, you got people who are strong and people who are weak. And sometimes when problems come, the weak ones kind of fall away. They kind of, and the church ends up stronger and purer because you got rid of the chaff. Okay? That's what happens. And God can use it in that way. Division is bad, done by Satan, but God can use the same division, just like God can use suffering inflicted by the devil. He can use that to help us and make us stronger. He can use division to show who's really faithful and who's not. It shows you who really belongs to the Lord, who's not. That's what verse 19 is telling us here. There must be factions. They're going to come so that those who are approved may be recognized. The really faithful ones kind of float to the top, and everybody knows. You know, when you go through a rough time, you know who's really hanging in there with the Lord because they don't run off. and they hang in there and they work it out and they stay with it. But you always got these brethren, if the least little thing happens, away they go, they're gone. And there's no integrity to them. There's no try and work it out to them. There's none of that. And so it has a way of separating people to who's approved and who's not. And so God can use those circumstances for his benefit and for his glory, even though it was instigated by the devil. So Paul says, I'm inclined to believe these rumors because sometimes those things happen. Therefore, verse 20, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. Well, that's a big problem right there, because that's why they were supposed to be coming together in the first place. Now, I said that. How do I know that's what they were supposed to be doing?
I think examples we have through the New Testament.
Okay.
That's what they done. They met together on the first day of the week.
Yep.
So,
And then later in the text, remember, he brings them back. This is what the Lord told us. Jesus took bread and broke it and said, do this in remembrance of me. He took the cup and said, do this in remembrance. So he brings them back. And this is what we call restoration. He's restoring them to the original pattern. They had left it. They left the pattern. And he's restoring them. When we talk about restoring the church, we're talking about restoring people. We are the church. We are the church. And so when we talk about restoring the church, we're talking about restoring people. And what are we restoring them to? Restoring them back to the Lord's ways. That's what this is all about. And that's what Paul does here. They'd left the Lord's ways in the way they took the Lord's Supper, and he's bringing them back. This is what you need to be doing instead of all this garbage you've been doing. Let's get back to the basics here. So it is not to take the Lord's Supper. And then he explains why, verse 21, for in eating, each one takes his own supper. Notice that. It's not the Lord's Supper, but his own supper. So they had messed this thing up big time. And we don't have all the details here. All we have is what's written here. So we kind of have to read between the lines here. But when you read between the lines, this is a big old mess. This is a great big old mess. And yet, I want you to think about this. Paul still identifies them as brethren and the church of God. That doesn't mean what they were doing was right, but it means he saw hope here. He saw hope in bringing them back and trying to correct them and get them back on the right pathway. This is what, in other words, he didn't just write them off the first time he heard about this. Well, I ain't going to have nothing to do with that bunch. No, he worked to save them. He worked to bring them around to the truth and get them to see the right way to do things. All right. Questions, comments up to this point? Okay. In verse 22, we have Paul's reaction to all this. He's told us what they're doing, which isn't right. And we have his reaction here, and he asks two questions. Notice that. Do you not have houses to eat and drink in, or do you despise the church of God? And then right before those two questions, there's a little word. What is it? What? And what he's basically saying is, what's the problem? What's going on? Which one of these two things here is the real issue? What's going on there? Okay? What? What's the deal? What's the problem? Is it, number one, that you don't have any houses to eat and drink in? Answer that question for me. Did they have houses to eat and drink in?
Yep.
Sure they did. And you can prove it by looking at the very last verse. If anyone is hungry, let him eat at home. So guess what? We just eliminated that. That's not the problem. That's not the problem. They had houses to eat and drink in. That leaves us with question 2. Or do you despise the church of God? Aha! That's what it was. They despised the church of God. Now, notice carefully, it's not you despise the church house. This is not the church. This building is not the church. In Bible times, they didn't even have church buildings. He's not talking about, the problem here is not where they were. You know, sometimes people take this to the point where it's absolutely wrong to eat anything in the church building. Well, that's just simply not true. You're making up a rule because they didn't even have church buildings in the Bible. How can you say that when they didn't even have church buildings in the Bible? I've had an office at the building before, and I come there to study, and I bring me a hamburger in there and sit down at my desk and eat my hamburger while I'm studying. Did I sin? I don't think I did. And the elders knew it, the other elders knew it, nobody said a word about it. It's not where they were. Where they were was not the problem, okay? What is the church then? You despise the church. It wasn't the building they despised. What did they despise?
The gathering of the believers.
There you go. They despised the congregation. You're supposed to be coming together to worship. This is supposed to be serious and solemn, and look what you've done. You're despising the church. That's bad stuff right there. Who purchased the church? Christ. Whose church is it? Christ. Who's head of the church? Christ. So think about that. And you're despising his church. And I would suggest there's 3 ways they despise the church. Number 1, by dividing its members. We saw that in verses 18 and 19. There are divisions among you. They despise the church. When you take God's church, it's supposed to be one. It's supposed to be united. And you come in there and you divide it, whether it's rich versus poor, black versus white, or male versus female, you come in there and divide it, you're a problem. Okay? So that's despising the church. Number 2, they despise the church by corrupting its worship. You're supposed to be worshiping, taking the Lord's Supper, and here you are getting drunk and eating a common meal. Oh, man, I would be embarrassed to be one of these Corinthians right about now. And number 3, they despise the church by perverting its mission. The church is a spiritual organization. I'm talking about the local church here. The local church is a spiritual organization. We're not a social club. We're not a baseball league. We're not a football league. And yet what do you see in modern churches? All of those things. Churches become social clubs. They become sports facilities. Some churches even build gymnasiums. I have a church not far from where I lived up in Indiana, just down the road, Church of Christ, built a great big old huge gymnasium. Of course, they didn't call it that. They called it a multi-purpose room. Or some churches call it a fellowship hall, because who can be against fellowship? See, they put a Bible word on it and make it sound like it's biblical when it's not. And what can you imagine what Paul would say to that? You know, what are you doing here? Spending $500,000 to build a gymnasium in a church house when you're not even supposed to be a sports facility. What are you doing? What are you doing? So, despising the church of God is a big deal. It's God's church. It's laid out his way. It has his work that's given to it and his organizational structure. And when we violate that, we're despising the church. I wouldn't want to be that person where Paul would say that. You're despising the church of God. That's a big deal. Questions, comments? Yes. I can tell you
You said a while ago that most of the time when there's trouble, the faithful stay and the weak go away.
Yeah.
In today's so-called church, unfaithful, sometimes the few faithful have to leave.
Yeah, because the unfaithful are outnumber them, and they have more pull. You're right. Sometimes it's the faithful have to pull out, and that kind of goes to what Paul said: "Come out from among them and be ye separate, and touch not what is unclean." So yeah, that's right. But it still has that separating effect between the faithful and the unfaithful. But despise the church of God, and not only are you despising the church, but you're shaming the poor. Don't forget the rest of that sentence. You shame those who have nothing. And so this is a strong rebuke of what these people are doing. And you would think that some of our brethren would read these verses and gain some knowledge here, but they don't. You know, they continue to build their fellowship halls and kitchens and all that, and it's like this passage doesn't even exist. Yes?
You know what the Greek or Hebrew word is for drunk in verse 21?
Yeah, it's methuo or methusko. It's drunk.
So it is drunk.
Yeah, it is drunk.
It doesn't mean fool.
No. I've heard preachers make that argument. You look it up, it's the Greek word methuo or methusko. It means drunk. Yeah, it doesn't mean full. I know some people try to make that argument, but let's just understand what they were doing here. This was an absolute disaster. They were actually getting drunk. Did I answer your question? Anything else you want to add to that?
Well, not yet.
Okay. Yes.
If you want to prove it was okay to drink, this here where it says, what have you not had is to eat and drink in, when the verse just before that says, talking about them being drunk.
Yeah.
Do you think you...
I don't think it would authorize it. I mean, he's clearly not happy with what they're doing. And we have these other passages about like drinking parties and things of that nature. So I don't think it's showing any approval of this at all. And when we were talking about alcohol, I think back when I first got here, I think we made the point, I think we did, that some of their drink, Their alcohol was not like ours, okay? Ours is distilled, for example, okay? Distilled liquor has a whole lot higher alcohol content. Theirs was naturally fermented. It would only go so far, and then it would stop. And then what else did they do with it on top of that? Diluted it with water. So it wasn't the strong drink. The strong drink is condemned in the Bible. It wasn't what they drank regularly. Wasn't strong drink, intoxicating drink. It may have had a 0.5% alcohol or something in it, but it wasn't intoxicating. I don't know if that answers your question or not. No?
It's just hard to separate the two verses, those two verses.
Yeah.
To prove that, because he's talking about them, they're drunk and eating.
Yeah.
Don't you have hazards to drink and eating?
Yeah.
It would be hard if I was wanting to drink, which I'm not.
I know, I understand.
But it would be hard to convince me.
Yeah, and there are hard passages like that. There's John 2, where Jesus turned the water into wine. There are hard passages. They're explainable. But, you know, if someone's looking for an excuse to drink, they'll find it.
He's contingent.
Yeah. There's that old contentious man again. If someone's looking for an excuse to drink, they'll find it.
Or anything else.
Or anything else. But from the drinking perspective, I always thought for the Christian, the safest and best thing you can do, I mean, you can quibble about John 2 and the water turned into wine. You can quibble about this and quibble about that. But the safest thing, without a doubt, is leave the stuff alone. Then there's never any question, there's never any doubt. You are sober, you are faithful, and there's never any doubt about it at all. And so that's, to me, the safest course, is leave the stuff alone. You're hurting your example, you're hurting your influence. Just leave the stuff alone.
It seems they had to drink a lot of that weak alcohol.
Yes. Yeah, you'd have to have quite a bit of it to get drunk.
So it's odd that they can come together as a church and drink enough to get drunk.
Yeah.
You know, in a short period of time.
Yep. And it could have been they had some of those brethren who were using for an excuse, you know. This is my excuse, you know, to get drunk. Rest of verse 22. What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I certainly do not praise you. I'm not happy about any of this. This is a complete and utter disaster. And my time has just run out, so I'll hush. We'll start with verse 23 next week.